We're peering into the crystal ball as we continue our Phoenix Suns preview coverage for the 2021-2022 NBA season, coming right up here on Locked On Suns.
You are Locked On Suns, your daily Phoenix Suns podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
We are back. This is Locked On Phoenix Suns. I promise I do indeed know what year it is. It is 2021. This is the 2021-22 NBA season, and it is what we are here to preview today. I'm your host, Brendon Kleen, credentialed media member covering the Phoenix Suns the past 5 seasons. Follow me on Twitter at Brendon Kleen14. Follow the show on Twitter at Locked On PHX Suns, and thank you for making Locked On Suns your first listen every single morning. We are going to preview the season again today, part 10 of our Suns preview series, 13 questions that will define the Phoenix Suns season. Appreciate you guys sticking through this. It's a fun experiment, a new way to cover the season, and I am going to have guests the rest of the week, so do not worry there. Recap of the final preseason game on Wednesday against Portland, and 2 more questions to be answered after this one, in addition to that recap show, which will have a smaller question there at the end. So we're wrapping up. We are getting to it. Again, this is the last week without Suns regular season basketball for months. I mean, hopefully many months, right? Next Wednesday is opening night for the Suns. And if we're lucky, we'll be getting basketball through June here in the Valley. So very, very exciting. I do want to remind everybody quickly before I start on question number 10 here to subscribe to the YouTube channel, which is something I've always said, but I actually don't think I've said this recently. The listener survey, it's been linked at the bottom of every single show, whether you're listening on Apple or Spotify or whatever audio platform you like, as well as on YouTube. That listener survey link has been there. I'm sure you've seen it. Go do me a favor, click on it, fill out the survey. It'll give your feedback and input into the show, which of course benefits you, and it also benefits me so that I know how you're listening, how often you're listening, where you're listening, and what you would like to see this show do that it is not already doing. That's the last ask on my end. Let's get right to it. Today's question number 10 is this the core that the Suns will have for the rest of their championship window? Is this what this core will look like? And you might be thinking that question is bizarre, and I'm not just talking about Chris Paul. So there are a lot of angles, and that's why I picked it. And it's a good time to kind of look at this because we're talking about DeAndre Ayton and this contract extension, talking about Mikhail Bridges and his extension. We just came off of a whole summer full of Chris Paul chatter, and will he sign and how much will it be for and everything else. You know, we have covered a lot of ground in this preview series leading up to this point, which is, you know, a look at Monty Williams and James Jones with Dwayne Rankin, the Suns beat writer. We've also looked at player development with Damon Allred and with Robbie Calland and others, Max McCauley, of course. So it's a good time to basically sum it all up and start to wrap this series up. And the way that I see all of that coming together here is to really be honest with ourselves and think, is this core going to be the one that the Suns stick with? So I want to start with the Chris Paul part. And I think the obvious answer is no, right? I mean, that's the realistic answer here. He's not going to be around for the entirety of a player like DeAndre Ayton's prime. That just their timelines don't line up. Chris Paul is nearing 40 years old. DeAndre Ayton is, you know, not even nearing 30 yet. So that's pretty obvious to say. And I think the next place you go is clearly, well, what do the Suns do there, right? And I think that there is part of me, and it's been something that I'm sure you guys have traced if you've been listening to this series, and I would obviously encourage all of you to seek out the rest of the series. They are all labeled either as 13 questions episodes or just with the question mark at the end, and you can kind of fill in the blanks yourself there. That Devin Booker and his growth and his explosion is something that I'm counting on. And that's been a real realization for me doing this series, bringing guests on, talking to folks about this team, watching them in the preseason and thinking about them and everything else, has been that their best path to being elite and great and better than they were last year is Booker to become one of the absolute best players in the entire league. And so, I mean, the part of me that thinks about the Chris Paul thing and also understands and believes that about Devin Booker is pretty optimistic that the Suns can move on from Chris Paul, find a replacement for him, and not miss much of a beat. I do want to remind everybody, while it was puzzling that they did not go after a Tyrese Halliburton or a Kyra Lewis in the 2020 draft last year, the Suns, I do feel I think that the caliber of player that they will be looking for with a improved Booker, an improved Mikhail Bridges, and an improved DeAndre Ayton, which we'll get to in a moment, if all of those will be here, is another question. But if you just operate in a vacuum where Chris Paul is gone because he has retired and has aged out of competing in the NBA, and the rest of the core, for the most part, is there, the caliber of point guard that the Suns would be looking for doesn't have to be somebody as excellent as Chris Paul. It doesn't have to be somebody who's pounding the rock every single possession, who is controlling every facet of the game, the pace, which sets being called, who's going to score, and all that. It can be a little bit of a lesser player. A lot of the guys we were all talking about back in at the 29th pick in the summer for this year's NBA draft, Jaden Springer, Miles McBride, Bones Highland, some of these guys I think fit that mold of players who were going to be more complementary pieces. With that said, the Suns do have, after this season, where in next June's draft, they will not have their first round pick in all likelihood. It is protected top 12. I would expect that, actually, that's not true at all. It's protected top 12, which means that they may indeed have it. Okay. I owe you all money. I'm so sorry. I should have a virtual tip jar where I just put money, because I apparently cannot read protections. The point is the Suns will not have their pick in 2022. They will have to figure it out without that, because they're not going to land in the top 12, which means they will give up the pick. And after that is my point. They have all their picks, every single pick, first and second round in perpetuity. The Suns have thereafter. So you could imagine a situation pretty easily where the Suns are able to go ahead and get a player in that same vein, Springer, McBride, whomever it might have been, Terrence Mann, or Trey Mann, and not miss a ton of a beat. But that requires these guys to get better, which we will talk about. So the Chris Paul factor doesn't worry me that much at all. And we haven't addressed the obvious elephant in the room when it comes to the point guard spot, which is Cameron Payne. I think he has shown himself to be more than capable. I think he will continue to get better. We think of him as so old and everything else, but I actually think he's a guy who will continue to grow, who can get better at finishing, who can get even better defensively, who can get better running an offense in the half court and not just needing to push the pace to be effective. You know, in the half court, he's most effective off the ball a lot of the time, or as a secondary playmaker. And then in transition is where he's really going to take the attacking opportunities and go to the basket or set up a teammate. You can imagine a world in which Payne gets better in the half court and is better as a defender and more consistent at all three levels as a scorer, gets 5, 10, 15% better in all three of those parts of his game. And that's a starting caliber player easily. I mean, there's probably teams, and I was saying this back during free agency, probably teams who would be fine with Cam Payne starting for them right now. And so, especially with the way the league is going with so many wing creators. And so if Booker becomes a player like that, if Mikhail Bridges gets closer to being a player like that, and DeAndre Ayton gets a little bit better as a creator himself, you don't need a Chris Paul. And so that to me makes me feel more optimistic that while the obvious answer to part of this question of will this core be the one that the Suns take through the rest of their championship window, the obvious answer to that is no, because you'd like to imagine the Suns' championship window extends far past when Chris Paul retires. And in order for that to happen, they're going to need to address that position and have a replacement in place. I think that can be some combination of a drafted player, even in late in the first round, those other young guys getting better, and Cameron Payne. And I really do believe that. I think that that's true. And we haven't even talked about Landry Shamet, who I think should be considered as well. I just want to see a little bit more. So the answer to that part of it is it will be okay. And I think it can sustain, that this core is able to push through the eventual departure of Chris Paul and continue to compete for titles and be a high-level team. Let's get to the rest, though, because obviously that's the other major part is, well, what does it look like for those guys to do it? I don't really want to touch too much on the development part because we've done that in so many other episodes recently. Again, listen to all of them, Max, Damon, Robbie, all we've talked about with all of those guys, a ton of developmental stuff for the rest of this core. But I want to really get into the team building part of this. So let's do that in a quick second. First, though, a word from Sleeper. In 2018, the fantasy sports experts over at Sleeper realized fantasy basketball was broken. Games were being won and lost based solely on whose players had more scheduled games that week. It made no sense, required very little strategy. So in 2020, Sleeper released a brand new way of playing fantasy basketball called Game Picks, only available on the Sleeper app. In Game Picks, owners pick a single game per week for each starter to count toward their team's total score, ensuring an even number of games played between all opponents. The days of losing because your opponent's players simply had more scheduled games in that week are over. The days of mindless, busy work, just setting your lineup repeatedly is over. And the days of giving up halfway through the season because of all of that are over as well. So whether you prefer redraft, keeper, or dynasty leagues, Game Picks has you covered. Sleeper cracked the fantasy basketball code. And if you play fantasy football and have grown to love that sport, well, it's a sport. If you prefer building out a weekly strategy versus the mindless, busy work every single day, you're going to love Game Picks because that's exactly what Game Picks is. Download the Sleeper app, start a league with your friends today, and enjoy. Back here, thank you for making Locked On Suns your first listen every single morning. Happy Tuesday. Let's get to the team building. Again, question number 10 of our Suns preview series here, and it is, will this core be the one that the Suns continue to have through their championship window? And I want to get into the nuts and bolts of some of this stuff here because I want to clarify what the young core is. And I think that that is probably the main question to ask, right? Who are we counting as part of this and who is reasonable to include in terms of that young core that the Suns are going to try to keep? So let's start with some numbers and then get to some other numbers. The first ones are lineup data. And the Suns during the playoffs with the group on the floor of Chris Paul, Devin Booker, Mikhail Bridges, Cameron Johnson, and DeAndre Ayton were a minus 21.4 per 100 possessions. That's according to Cleaning the Glass. Go to the regular season, and it was beautiful. I mean, it was easily their second best lineup. They played it the second most, and I guess you could even say it was their best, although it was so substantially second to the Crowder starting lineup that I just tend to say they're fairly equal. This Cam lineup with Cam Johnson in there was plus 9.8. The Crowder lineup was plus 5.5, but that Crowder lineup played more than 4 times as much as the Cam Johnson unit. So either way, it was one of their absolute best lineups. They just scored at a breakneck pace, 129.9 points per 100 possessions. The defense was middle of the pack, not too great, but at the end of the day, you score that well and you survive on defense. That's still a championship recipe. And the numbers spoke for themselves. Even that Crowder lineup, the offense was much more of a factor than the defense. Now in the playoffs, the Crowder lineup stayed above water, was still very, very good, whereas the Cam Johnson lineup, again, was in the negative. So, of course, you're getting the point that I'm making, which is that Cam Johnson lineup is what we're talking about when we talk about the young core. Jay Crowder only on contract for one more year after this one. I don't think anybody would be caught arguing that Crowder is part of the young core of the Suns. He is clearly a stopgap option. Cam Johnson, obviously, an alternative to him. You also have Jalen Smith in the mix. I'm not forgetting there, but for all intents and purposes, I think of Cam far more than Jalen Smith, and we don't even know if Smith will be on the team. So that's really who I'm talking about. It's Booker, Bridges, Johnson, and Ayton, and that gets us to the second set of numbers. And that second set of numbers is the contract numbers here. So Cleaning the Glass has a nice tool as well with salary. It's similar to like the trade machine and different things like that, but you can also sign players to contracts under this little software. So what I went ahead and did is I dreamt up a situation where we have Devin Booker, Chris Paul, DeAndre Ayton, Crowder, Bridges, Johnson, and I signed the young guys to new deals. So what I did is I signed Cam Johnson starting in 2023 to a 4-year, $60 million deal, which maybe is on the low end. Well, TBD. We don't have to think about that yet, but that's just a ballpark. DeAndre Ayton, 5-year, $207, as if he makes all NBA and gets the absolute max he can get. And then I did Mikhail Bridges starting at a 4-year deal starting at $22 million, which gets him to about 95. It just felt like a right down the middle type of option. So that's where we ended up. And things get expensive, to say the least. And so that's really where I wanted to go. Those numbers for those players, you get very quickly to next season, 22-23, the Suns would be $13 million over the cap, provided that they still have Crowder, still have Saric, still have Payne on the roster, and then Jalen Smith will still be there, Abdul Nader will still be there. $13 million over the luxury tax line. And of course, you all can do math and you understand why that's very expensive. That would mean a huge luxury tax bill. And it would also mean it would inhibit the Suns from continuing to build out the roster, right? I mean, it would prevent them from adding much of any talent. They would have tiny little exceptions, but effectively they'd be stuck with that team if they were to sign Cam to that contract, Mikhail to that contract, and DeAndre to that contract. I'm going to flash it up on the YouTube screen right here so you guys can see what I'm talking about. Again, that's courtesy of Cleaning the Glass. And then the next season, despite losing Crowder and Saric off the books and JaVale McGee off the books, if they don't choose to re-sign him, you're still looking at a team that has a ton of space under the tax, but is $14 million over the cap with just 7 players under contract. Of course, there might be rookies that get drafted between now and then. That would get them to 7 or 8 players, but that's what we're looking at. So it is going to be an uphill climb. And I think that's the obvious place that you just have to be weary of if you're building this roster, if you're a fan at home wondering if this roster can stay together. It is going to get extremely expensive. All of the hand-wringing we were all doing about Cameron Payne's contract, Chris Paul's contract over the summer, the hand-wringing we're doing right now with these extensions. Yes, you can simultaneously believe that the Suns should pay what it takes to keep this roster together, but that doesn't mean that the concerns over how they're going to continue to build the roster are not valid. They are. It's going to be hard. It's going to be counting on this young core to be great. And so I think the obvious place to look from there before we make our final decision, and I give you some thoughts on whether I think this group will actually stay intact, is to talk about trades. Talk about how could this roster change? How could it look different? How could it improve while still being a little bit more flexible? Is there a way to get another star player rather than giving your salary split in so many ways and everything else? So that's what we'll do here in just 1 second. First, though, a quick word from BetOnline.ag, which is back and better than ever as all eyes are on the gridiron with teams back for another football season. Again, BetOnline, your number one spot for all the pro and college football action all season long. With a new updated site and interface, you get even more odds, props, and contests courtesy of BetOnline, which continues to be once again the number one source for everything football. So head to the website or use your mobile device. Again, that's betonline.ag. Make an account, and when you do, use the promo code LOCKEDON when you make your first deposit to get a 50% welcome bonus straight to your account. Again, that's promo code LOCKEDON when you make your first deposit at betonline.ag to get a 50% welcome bonus straight to your account. From football, basketball, and boxing to your favorite Vegas casino games, don't wait to take advantage of all the amazing offers throughout the 2021 football season. BetOnline is the fastest and easiest way to bet on all of your favorite sports through football season and beyond. BetOnline, where the game starts. Okay, last but not least here, as we're answering the question number 10 in our 13 questions that will define the Phoenix Suns season, is this the core that will take the Suns through their championship window? We'll answer that as it pertains to trades. Thank you for making Locked On Suns your first listen here on this Tuesday morning or potentially Wednesday. I don't know what your order is. Maybe you save a couple. Maybe you wait a little bit and pile up Locked On Suns episodes. I do that same thing myself. I'm not going to lie. I love Locked On Cardinals. I'll wait a couple days sometimes, let those guys put out a couple shows and listen to them back to back. So, well, maybe it's Wednesday. And thank you for making me your first listen on Wednesday, whatever it may be. But let's get to it. Let's get to these trade possibilities and the positive, the optimistic about not only what I said in that first segment about the Suns having all of their picks after this season, but also the stacking of contracts is that you become way more flexible on the trade market. You have salaries you can actually deal. I mean, we all know how painful it was to watch the Suns do the Chris Paul trade in some ways, because maybe they would have liked to keep Kelly Oubre. In an ideal world, sure, they would have potentially liked to do that, right? I mean, maybe they wait to do it after the draft and they're able to trade Jalen Smith and keep Kelly Oubre. I don't know what the situation may have been, but the reality was the Suns did not have those middling contracts, and they did not have many big contracts at all to stack upon one another. So it had to be Oubre, it had to be Rubio. Those were really the only two big contracts that they could put together, in addition to obviously Devin Booker, who's not going anywhere. So what you get when you have that, if we're operating under my made-up world where Cam and DeAndre and Mikhail all sign extensions that are kind of at various levels, you have Mikhail Bridges next season making $22 million, $23 million the year after. You have Cam Johnson in 2023-24 when his extension would kick in, making $14 million in my estimation. And then, of course, you have the big one with DeAndre Ayton making 38.6. But below that, the two guys who also signed this summer re-signed here. You have Chris Paul at 31 and Cam Payne at 6.5. So you have contracts up and down the structure, the layer, the levels of this pyramid. And then that's not to mention this very season, you're going to have Chris Paul, or you're going to have Jay Crowder and Dario Saric, both in the 8 to 10 range. And then next season, same thing. So the Suns are very, very, very well equipped right now to have the flexibility to be a player on the trade market. I'm not saying that this means I think that this core cannot win with the way that it's currently constructed, or that this team is going to be so expensive that it can't be kept together. I'm not saying any of those things. I'm saying that there is a world in which the Suns can make trades that they were not going to be able to make previously. Still, unless they trade a Mikhail Bridges or DeAndre Ayton or a Cam Johnson, and maybe even if they do trade those players, they are still not going to be at the very top of many discussions. Now, I guess you could make the case Ayton is the one exception. I do think his trade value would be very, very high. I think he's proven himself. I think there's a ton of teams that will look around the league and say, if we had a big man like that, our defensive problems would be solved, and we would have an elite offensive role player who can have a ceiling to be much more than that. And I do think there would be a market there. So if you're talking about a Bradley Beal, or you're talking about a Damian Lillard, although he doesn't fit here, that is real. Ayton would be a massive chip. But if you're stacking, Bridges plus picks, Cam Johnson plus picks, Jalen Smith plus Cam Johnson plus picks, that's not a package that's going to beat out the best of the best of the best across the league. The Warriors have a ton of lottery talents who they don't have any attachment to right now. There are blue chip players all across the league. The Pelicans have players. The Kings have players who they could trade. This Suns team, this Suns roster would be really constructed in such a way that it would be looking more at a trade kind of like what the Spurs were able to put together, or what the Raptors were able to put together to when they traded for Kawhi Leonard. And it would, they don't have a DeMar DeRozan, but they have good but not great youngish players, sort of in their prime talents, plus pretty mediocre picks. And that's really what you would be looking at for the Suns. So you're either looking at a situation in which you cash in DeAndre Ayton for an incredible star, you're really in the conversation there, and you're giving up a game-changing big man, or you're trading some of these lesser players and hoping that you get lucky, hoping that there's an eye of the beholder beauty for some other team in the league that goes ahead and wants to trade for a Bridges or a Cam Johnson. And I don't think any of those seem realistic. I don't really feel like the Suns are in that position, but I also think you have to consider the fact that James Jones is going to be aggressive. I think that this team, for the most part, is good because of the way that it has been put together into something that's greater than the sum of its parts. I think that's what makes it special. So I don't think you jeopardize that, but we also know there's been plenty of times where we were not expecting James Jones to make a move, and he went ahead and did anyway, trading for Tyler Johnson, trading for Kelly Oubre, trading for Chris Paul. There have been many moments when they did not need to make a move, or it did not necessarily seem obvious that they might make a move, and yet they did anyway. Landry Shamet, another example. Trading is James Jones's favorite thing to do on this planet as a general manager, and I think he will always be on the lookout for something like that. I think if you're looking for candidates, it has to be Cam Johnson. And if it's going to be Cam Johnson, you wonder if it would be sooner rather than later. And I don't think it's crazy to expect that we may see a deal like that faster than we're expecting. Maybe a team is interested going into next season when his extension might kick in, or if he obviously doesn't get dealt prior to being able to sign that extension, that it gives that team the rights in restricted free agency. Maybe we see a trade for Crowder or Saric or both in the near future that we're not expecting. Saric would almost for sure be involved in any Thaddeus Young deal, for instance. So I think this group will look different. I think on the fringes, you could see Cam Johnson moving. But as much as I'm all game to gossip and have fun with the DeAndre Ayton debate as often as I do and as often as we all love to, and he's endlessly fascinating, and this extension stuff has only kicked that into hyperdrive, I do tend to lean toward continuity here. I think that the entire franchise values that, especially after what it's gone through the past decade. And I think that you have to look at this team honestly and say that what makes it great is the cohesion that it has and the identity that it has. I've been talking about that all preseason. So to blow that up just because of a star across the league that you get excited about, or, the money you may have to pay, I think those are things you can kick down the road. Is there a point at which this team becomes inhibitively expensive and you can't build the way you'd like to? Potentially. And there is a restriction. This isn't the Warriors, which just print money. This is a team that has to consider those things. But I also think you have to consider the fact that Chris Paul can be traded himself. So there are so many different options. They have an answer after Chris Paul is gone, and they have means of getting better via trade or via internal development where they're able to continue to ride this core as a great team past Chris Paul and his period here, especially if Devin Booker can become the elite guy that we know he has the goods to become. So I think the short answer is yes. I do think this is going to be effectively the core that the Suns have as they make their way through this championship window. And I think that championship window can last fairly long. So I think there's tons of reason to be optimistic. And I think this season and next offseason will teach us a ton about what exactly that's going to look like. I'm excited to watch it. I'm excited to watch it on the court. I'm excited to see how it plays out off the court. It's going to be a very fun next few years to be a Suns fan if it wasn't already fun enough. And I'm sure you guys all feel very similarly. So that was a good question to do today, I think, to set the week off a little bit and to start to wrap this thing up here in our 13 question series. Appreciate all of you guys listening throughout. There will be a few more. I can for sure now announce as well that Jake Fisher of Bleacher Report will be joining later in the week to talk even more trades, maybe more short-term possibilities for the Suns. Jalen Smith, Thaddeus Young, what's going on here, and will any of that actually happen? So I'll bring the man who has been reporting on this stuff all off season long right here on this very show. So stay tuned for that. Stay tuned for the recap of the final preseason game on Thursday. And I'm going to keep putting this stuff out. I'll have even more previews and predictions next week as well. Appreciate you guys all listening. Enjoy your Tuesday, and I'll be with you right here tomorrow.